He was standing at the reception desk. His back was to me. He didn't know I was there. He was talking to my front desk manager in a low voice, and she looked uncomfortable. I watched him for about 30 seconds before he turned around. When he saw me, he smiled. Like nothing was strange. Like he hadn't just driven 4 hours without telling me. Like he wasn't holding a folder I'd never seen before. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I built something. Not overnight. Not with help. I built it over 6 years, starting from a rented desk in a shared office space, working contracts nobody else wanted, undercutting my own rates, just to get a foothold. By the time I was 31, I had a small but legitimate consulting firm. 12 employees. A physical office. 3 anchor clients, who collectively represented about 70% of our annual revenue. We weren't huge. But we were real. We were profitable. And we were growing. My father had never worked in business. He was a retired civil servant, and his view of private enterprise was that it was mostly luck, mostly fragile, and mostly for people who weren't disciplined enough to hold a government job. He'd said that more or less directly, more than once. When I opened my firm, he didn't come to the office. When I hired my first employee, he asked how I planned to pay them when things dried up. When we moved into a bigger space, he said, "Don't let the square footage fool you into thinking you're bigger than you are." I stopped telling him things. Not out of anger. Just because the information didn't seem to go anywhere useful once it reached him. So I kept my work life and my family life in separate boxes, and for a while, it worked fine. Then my mother got sick. Not critically, but enough that family gatherings became more frequent. And my father, with more time on his hands, started asking more questions. At first it was normal curiosity. How many people do you have now? What does the company actually do? I answered patiently. But the questions started to shift. He started asking about specific clients. Specific contracts. What our rates were. Whether we'd worked with anyone in the government sector. I gave general answers and redirected. Then one evening he said, almost casually, I ran into Gerald. Gerald was one of our anchor clients. The relationship was almost entirely mine. Gerald had known me since before I had a company, and he'd given us our first serious contract almost as a personal favor. I asked my father how he knew Gerald. He said they'd met at a function years ago. Said Gerald was a good man. Said he'd mentioned my name and Gerald had spoken highly of me. I said that was nice. My father nodded, smiled into his tea, and changed the subject. That should have been nothing. A coincidence. A harmless connection. But something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. I noticed, over the next few weeks, that he called me more often. And that the calls were always a little too interested in operational details. Who was managing which account? Whether we had any new contracts coming. Whether any of our existing clients had raised concerns. My wife said I was being paranoid. My business partner said family was complicated, and I should give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were right. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. The first real thing I found wasn't dramatic. It was an email. I wasn't looking for it. Our IT consultant was doing a routine system audit, checking for any unusual access patterns after we'd upgraded our client management software. He flagged one anomaly. A login from an unfamiliar device, accessing our client database, specifically the folders containing contract terms, billing rates, and contact information for our 3 anchor clients. The login had used valid credentials. The credentials belonged to my office manager, a woman I'd worked with for 4 years. She had no reason to access those specific folders. Her role didn't require it. And the timestamp was a Saturday afternoon, when she wasn't scheduled to be working. I pulled her aside privately and asked her about it. She went quiet for a moment that lasted too long. Then she told me. She said my father had called her. He told her he was helping me prepare a presentation for a potential investor and needed some figures. He'd asked her to log in and pull the relevant documents and forward them to an email address he gave her. She thought it had been approved by me. She'd forwarded 3 documents. Contract summaries, our rate sheets, and a business development report I'd prepared internally that outlined our growth strategy for the next 18 months, including which clients we planned to approach and on what terms. I asked her to write everything down. Exactly what he'd said. Exactly what she'd sent. I asked her not to speak to him again, and not to tell anyone else in the office. She apologized. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. Then I went back to my desk and sat very still for a few minutes. I started making calls. 2 days later, I found out why he wanted the information. A contact at a professional association mentioned, without realizing the significance, that a new consulting practice had recently registered and was already making introductory contact with organizations in our sector. Small, quiet, no visible online presence. But actively networking. I asked who was behind it. The name wasn't my father's. It was my cousin's. My cousin, who had spent years working low-level administrative roles and had no background in consulting, had just registered a firm in our exact service area. My father had never mentioned this to me. I found the registration documents online. The company had been incorporated 6 weeks earlier. The registered address was my father's home. I looked at the filing date. It was 2 weeks before the first time he'd casually mentioned running into Gerald. That week, I had lunch with Gerald on a routine basis. I didn't bring any of this up. But I paid attention. At one point Gerald mentioned that he'd received a message from a contact, suggesting there might be more affordable options for the services we provided. He said he'd ignored it. He thought it was a generic cold pitch. He hadn't connected it to my family. I didn't tell him what I knew. Not yet. I went home that evening and laid everything out. The unauthorized access. The forwarded documents. The company registration. The approach to our client. It was all circumstantial until it wasn't. The email address my office manager had forwarded documents to. I traced it through our IT consultant. It was registered under a variation of my cousin's name. Everything my father had obtained through deception had been fed directly into a competing business designed to undercut me with my own clients, using my own pricing, my own strategy, my own relationships. I had it all documented within 5 days. Confronting them would have ruined everything. I made copies of everything before I touched anything else. That was the first rule my lawyer gave me, and I'd already done it before I called her. 2 external hard drives. 1 cloud backup, encrypted. 1 physical folder printed and stored at a location outside my home and office. She told me that was smart. She told me to stop there and let her look at what I had. Her name isn't important. What matters is that she'd spent 15 years doing commercial litigation, and she wasn't easily surprised. When I walked her through everything, the unauthorized access, the forwarded documents, the company registration, the client approach, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "This is more organized than most of what I see." That wasn't a compliment to me. She meant the scheme itself. She told me what we were looking at. The unauthorized access to our systems was potentially criminal under computer fraud statutes. The misappropriation of confidential business information, our rate sheets, our strategy documents, our client data, had civil implications. The approach to our anchor client using that information added another layer. She asked if I wanted to pursue this criminally, civilly, or both. I told her I wanted our business protected first. The rest could follow from that. She said that was the right answer. We spent 2 weeks doing everything quietly. I had my IT consultant prepare a formal written report on the unauthorized access, time-stamped and verified. My office manager provided a signed written statement detailing exactly what she'd been told and what she'd forwarded. I obtained the company registration documents myself, they were public record. My lawyer drafted a formal cease and desist and prepared a civil complaint. The criminal referral was prepared separately and held in reserve. During those 2 weeks, nothing changed on the surface. My father called twice. I answered both times. I was normal. I asked about my mother's health. I mentioned we had a busy period coming up at work. He asked a few questions that I now understood the purpose of. I gave him nothing useful, and he didn't seem to notice. My cousin reached out to one more of our clients during that period. The client called me to mention it, the way a vendor might give you a heads up that someone was asking around. I thanked them, said I was aware, and asked them to document the contact if they were comfortable doing so. They were. That became another piece of evidence. The week before everything moved, I had a quiet conversation with Gerald. I told him I needed him to know something, and I walked him through the relevant parts. Not everything. Just enough. He was angry in a way that was quiet and final. He'd been in business a long time. He understood immediately what had been attempted. He asked what he could do. I told him I just needed him to be available if someone reached out to confirm the timeline. He said he would be. My business partner found out during this period. He'd known something was off for weeks, but hadn't pushed. When I told him, he didn't say much. He asked what he could do. I told him to keep running the business normally, make sure our clients were well serviced, and not to speak to my father under any circumstances. He nodded and went back to work. That was the entire team. 4 people, including me, knew what was coming. My father and my cousin knew nothing. My cousin had begun advertising quietly in our sector. My father had started attending more industry events, networking on my cousin's behalf, making introductions using the credibility he'd borrowed from his association with me. They were building momentum. They thought the window was open. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. My lawyer served the cease and desist on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered to my cousin's registered address, which was my father's home, by a process server. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. My father called me 40 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. Then came a text. It said, "We need to talk." I read it and put my phone down, and went back to the contract review I was in the middle of. 2 hours later, he called from a different number. I picked up. He started to explain. There was a version of events where it was all a misunderstanding. Where my cousin had simply started a business in a related field. Where the documents were shared innocently, in good faith, to help me. Where the client contacts were just networking. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then I said, I have the email chain. I have the forwarded documents. I have the company registration. I have a signed statement. I have 2 clients who can confirm the approach. My lawyer has all of it. Silence. I said, the cease and desist outlines what needs to stop and what needs to be returned. If that happens, we handle this civilly. If it doesn't, the criminal referral goes in by Friday. He said my name. I said, I'm not angry. I just need it to stop. He said he didn't think it would go this far. I didn't ask what he meant by that. The cease and desist was complied with within 48 hours. My cousin's firm sent a written acknowledgement through their newly retained lawyer. They confirmed they would cease all contact with our clients. They confirmed deletion of the forwarded documents and agreed not to use any information obtained from our systems. They agreed to a formal undertaking, signed, witnessed, and filed. We held the criminal referral. That was my choice, not my lawyer's recommendation. She thought we had a strong case. But I decided that what I needed was the protection of my business, and I had that. Anything beyond it would have cost me time and energy I'd rather spend on work. 2 of the clients who'd been approached by my cousin stayed with us. One reached out specifically to say they had no intention of leaving. Gerald added 2 years to our contract. My cousin's firm dissolved quietly 4 months later. It never had a single client. My father and I haven't spoken since the call. There was no final confrontation. No tearful conversation. No closure meeting where things were said and understood. I didn't need one. I'd spent years trying to be understood by him, and had quietly stopped expecting it. What happened was simply the last version of a dynamic that had always been there. He had never believed I was building something real. So when it looked valuable, he decided to take it. The people who knew what he'd done, Gerald, my business partner, my lawyer, my office manager, none of them mentioned it again after it was over. There was no satisfaction in the telling. It was just a problem that had been handled. My wife asked me once, a few weeks later, if I was okay. I told her I was. She asked if I felt bad about how it ended with my father. I thought about it honestly. I said I felt the same way I felt after closing any other case. Like the work had been done correctly, and the matter was resolved. She nodded. She understood. I went to bed early that night. The office was locked. The contracts were in order. The clients were well. The firm was safe. That night, everything was quiet.